morning and welcome back. Today we're going to finish building our character profile of the grace changers. Jude talks about the false prophets that would come into the church and wreak havoc among the saints and among the fellowship. And so we're going to finish building this character profile today and then move on. But before I do that, I just want to give you some news about projects that I have in the works that are upcoming. So this is new technology for me. I'm having to learn new disciplines. Most of my lectures have been face-to-face with people, and so this is a totally new forum for me. Also learning how to use a movie editing program and lighting with green screen technology. So it's taking me a little bit of time to get up on top of this curve, but I'll get there. But I want to talk about what's coming next. There are 3 projects that I have in the works. One is entitled The Parables of Jesus, where I will go through all of the parables one by one, verse by verse, and learn what Jesus has for us in the parables. Another project that I'm working on is the Gospel of John, looking at the Gospel from a Messianic Jewish perspective. And then finally, a verse-by-verse exposition of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is known as the Apocalypse, or the story of the end of days, but really is it the end of days, or really does it signify change that must come before a new beginning takes place? And so those are projects that are all in the works, and I hope you will subscribe and join me, and we'll work through these things. But moving on today, one thing I want to say here as we move into the second part here of building this character profile is this is just that. It's a character profile. This is who these men and women are on the inside. And oftentimes what they are on the inside, they are able to conceal from the outside. Well, Jude gives us instruction on that and how that they manifest themselves externally. We'll look at that in the next session. But I want to finish up this session today, so let's move on with the grace changers, building a character profile, part 2. So in this session, we're going to complete the character sketch of the grace changers. We're going to consider the apocryphal assumption of Moses for a moment. So it's referenced here in the writing of Jude, and we're going to just take a brief look at that, what that writing is, what its origin is, and what it supposedly says. And then we're going to take a few moments to connect some of these character attributes to make a personal moral inventory. Are there any of these attributes that we recognize as operative within our own lives? And so the scriptures call us to make positive change in those points where we do find contact with some of these character traits. And so that's how we're going to conclude this study today. Okay, so just by way of review, you'll remember that last session we talked about these grace changers, men who have crept in. And in verse 8 we read, likewise also these dreamers defile the flesh, reject authority, and speak evil of dignitaries. So we looked at the defiling the flesh, we looked at the prohibited interaction that was taking place not only at the interspecies level, but also at the transspecies level with the account in Genesis chapter 6. And so there's a generally defiling of the flesh and transgressing permissible bounds. They reject authority, and again, that is to refuse to act within permissible bounds. And they speak evil of dignitaries, that is, they are dismissive of spiritual entities and realities and authority structures. To them, the spiritual realm does not exist. It's just something that they can use to implement their own agenda. All 3 of these manifestations of rebellion were exemplified in the Old Testament examples listed in those verses that we looked at. And the key point here is they will be manifested in one way or another in the character of the grace changers. So let's continue to build now and move into Jude 9, where we read, Yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring against him a reviling accusation, but said, The Lord rebuke you. So what we have here is we have a quote out of an apocryphal work that's entitled The Assumption of Moses. So just to give you some background information on this, so the Assumption of Moses, also called the Testament of Moses, is a first century Jewish apocryphal pseudographical work. It purports to contain secret prophecies Moses revealed to Joshua before passing leadership of the Israelites to him. It contains apocalyptic or end-time themes, but is characterized as a testament, meaning it has the final speech of a dying person, Moses. The Assumption of Moses is known from a single 6th century incomplete manuscript in Latin. And so interestingly enough, when I accessed various readings of the Testament of Moses, you will not find this particular quotation there. That part has been lost, but this is all drawn from a 6th century incomplete manuscript. Let's go a little deeper into the background and what may have been contained in this apocryphal writing that has reference to this verse in Jude. So early in the 1st century, there was a story in the Testament of Moses, which was a Jewish writing. So it was Jewish. Jude's account seems to give allusion to that legend. Because some of the pages of this testament are missing, the following Jewish writings shed some light on the aforementioned. And so we can learn about what was in this by looking at some of the Jewish commentary on this book, The Assumption of Moses, that we pull out of the Targum and the Jewish writings. So in this particular commentary here, the first one we read, there was a dispute about an hour before Moses died. It was between the angel of death, associated with the adversary Satan, and Michael, Satan's opponent. Michael is the angel considered to be the defender of Israel in Jewish tradition. A second comment says this. It says that Michael was put in authority of watching Moses' tomb. It is thought that the Testament of Moses, not Scripture, added that Michael was assigned to bury Moses. And so we have these comments that come out of a Jewish commentary speaking to this event. But we also find in the writings of the early church fathers that this assumption of Moses was quoted numerous times. And so there's some historical validity to this account, although we don't accept it as inspired scripture. So what was Jude's point in referencing this? Well, let's go back to the text here. Once again, reading verse 9, we read, "Yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring against him a reviling accusation, but said, 'The Lord rebuke you.'" And so what comes next is a comment by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum out of his Ariel's Bible commentary. The hyperlink is there at the bottom. It's a great book. I want to recommend it to everyone. But he says this, "Michael, although he is an archangel, did not rail against Satan because, positionally, Satan is greater than Michael. Satan is a cherub, and Michael is an angel. Cherubs are positionally greater than angels. Michael, although he is the archangel, the one who has authority over all other angels, knew his place in the angelic hierarchy. Therefore, Michael did not rail against someone greater than himself, even though Satan was a fallen creature. Since Satan, even though fallen, was the anointed cherub, he still had a personal dignity that Michael respected." And so here we find this powerful being, Michael the archangel, recognizing and respecting the power and the position of Satan. And it's given in contrast to one of the character points of these false teachers who will come into the church. Notice what it says here in verse 10. "But these speak evil of whatever they do not know, and whatever they know naturally, like brute beasts. In these things they corrupt themselves." I gave you a couple of alternate English translations here to help us understand, what is being said by this verse. In the New Living Translation of the verse we read, "But these people scoff at things they do not understand. Like unthinking animals, they do whatever their instinct tells them, and so they bring about their own destruction." And Young Little's translation says it this way, "And these, as many things indeed as they have not known, they speak evil of, and as many things as naturally, as the irrational beasts, they understand. In these they are corrupted." So the point being here is that they are totally devoid of the concept of spiritual realities, totally devoid of a spiritual worldview. What do I mean by a spiritual worldview? Well, there is the world that we see and that we perceive through our five senses. And I talked about this a couple of sessions ago. But there is more to reality than just what we can see and perceive with our five senses. But this idea that there is more to reality comes by revelation. God reveals it to us, whereas this is not necessarily revealed to the animal kingdom. They operate on the basis of what their senses input to them as data. And so these men, these false prophets, are compared to these animals who scoff at the concept of spiritual realities. They scoff at the concept of a spiritual worldview because they cannot perceive them. They cannot see them. The words of revelation directly from God, are closed off to them. And so they totally discount them. And thus, they speak and act in a trifling way with spiritual entities and realities. Spiritual entities and realities are indeed just that. They're very real, and we need to be cognizant of them. We need to be respectful of them. And so these false teachers, they operate entirely on sensorial information, that is, physical instinct. It goes on and says, "Woe," which means misery, sorrow, distress, wretchedness to them. Why? "Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, have run greedily in the era of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah." Okay, let's take a look at these three things here. The first one is to travel in the footsteps of Cain. Now, interestingly enough, that word "way" there, in the way of Cain, actually speaks of a trajectory. It's a journey that he made. And so the end point of that journey for Cain was when, propelled by jealousy, hatred, and envy, he killed his brother. If you go back and look at the Old Testament account, it says that Cain was a tiller of the land. And that word tiller is very interesting in the Hebrew because it carries the sense of not only one who is a worker of the land, but in a certain sense, a slave of being a worker of the land. And so I thought about this and came to the conclusion that Cain would actually qualify as the prototypical workaholic, and that his job was his life, and what he could produce with his hand was ultimately his God. And so he wanted God to accept his sacrifice on his terms, according to Genesis chapter 4. And so his vocation actually became his idol. That was the thing that he worshipped. And when God did not place the same significance or importance upon it that he wanted him to put on it, then he was overrun by jealousy, hatred, and envy. To run the same road as Balaam, to rush headlong, driven by greed for profit. And so we know the story of Balaam. When the Israelites were journeying across the wilderness, the king of Moab asked Balaam, who was a pagan priest, he was steeped in the mystery religions of the East, and so the king of Moab called him to curse the Israelites, and he asked God permission to do it, but God denied him permission every time. Finally, we have the account of the donkey that saved his life there when he encountered the angel the angel of the Lord that was going to slay him. But later on, we read in the book of Numbers that Balaam figured out a way how to get the Israelites to stumble, how to, in essence, bring a curse upon them when he started counseling the Moabite women to begin to invite the Israelite men, and they began to intermarry, and the Israelites brought down upon themselves the chastisement of God, and Balaam was ultimately killed as well. But we see clearly here that the road that Balaam traveled was one that he was determined at all costs to get paid. And so we conclude that material wealth was actually his idol, was actually his God. And then third and final, we have here the path of the rebellion as that of Korah. And the account in Numbers chapter 16, where Korah challenged Moses' leadership and said, we're all the people of God, we should all have a say in this. And so he violated God's established chain of command. And so ultimately, power was his idol. So this is what we have here. Vocation was the idol, was the God that Cain ultimately worshipped, and it propelled him through jealousy, hatred, and envy to eventually commit murder. Balaam, his God was material wealth. He was seeking after material wealth. And Korah, his God was ultimately power worship. Okay, so we've kind of completed the list here. Let's look at these things again one by one. Character profile. Number one, they defile the flesh. They're absolutely willing to engage in prohibited interactions. And so there's a whole constellation here of what comes under this heading of prohibited interaction between men and women, interaction with civil authorities, and so they are not averse to defiling the flesh in all kinds of ways. Number two, they are totally devoid of the concept of spiritual realities and a spiritual worldview. They don't recognize anything other than what they can sense through their five senses and how they can use that to advance their agenda. Number three, they operate entirely on sensorial information, that is, physical instinct. Again, they have no concept of spiritual realities. Revelation is closed off to them, and they're just operating through what they can sense through their senses. They're propelled by jealousy, hatred, and envy, or the lust for recognition. They desire to be recognized and to attain status. They're driven by greed for profit, which is indeed the lust for status, right? Those who have material wealth, they also have status, and so there's a lust for status. They have no regard for God's established chain of command. So there is a lust there for power at work within these individuals. And we have plenty of warning about these false prophets, how they're able to infiltrate God's people. They're able to infiltrate the church, and they come in with these character traits that are not easily identified, because these are all internal traits that they're able to cloak and to cover and to not put on display in the church. And Paul warns us of this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting at verse 9, where we read, "And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. As the truth of Christ is in me, no one shall stop me from this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows. But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded, status, just as we are in the things of which they boast. For such are false prophets, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. And so here's just one passage where we're warned about these false prophets coming into the church who are actually ministers of Satan. They're deceitful workers and false prophets. And these character traits are what is driving them, what is propelling them from within. And they're not so easily recognizable on the outside. And so we have to pay attention and stay on guard. Okay, so now let's take a little bit of time for an internal inventory. So we see these character traits. None of them are desirable. But somewhere along the line here, we have to look at our own lives and see if any of this rubber meets the road in our lives. And so how are we doing with maintaining the physical sanctity of our bodies? The scriptures tell us that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Ghost, and that we are to maintain them in sanctity and holiness. How are we doing in our relationships with other people? How are we maintaining the bounds of physical sanctity in our relationships with our spouses? Are we crossing the line? What are we involving ourselves in? How are we doing with that? Number two, are we living our lives, are we living our daily lives cognizant of the spiritual realities and entities that surround us? It seems to me that for the most part we live our lives in carefully constructed boxes, and anything that comes along and falls outside of that carefully constructed box or boundaries, we tend to deny, or we don't pay attention to. It's the stuff of conspiracy theories. But the reality is the reality is much bigger than the boxes that we construct for ourselves to live in, or the boxes that others construct for us to live in. The universe is full of mystery. It's full of wonder. And we need to be willing to go outside the boundaries of that box and see these things. And so are we cognizant of the spiritual realities? Are we cognizant of the entities that surround us all around? Is our decision-making process driven by instinct and emotion, or is it driven by Scripture? What is it? What is it that informs us when we're presented with a choice between two or more options? Where do we go to find the best solution, the solution that is right for the circumstance? Do we go to the Scripture, or do we react on emotion? Reacting on emotion is oftentimes not the right response. It's time to reflect and look into the Scriptures and see if the Scriptures talk about a similar circumstance and how we can receive guidance and instruction from that. So is our decision-making process driven by instinct and emotion, or is it driven by Scripture? Are we struggling with jealousy, envy, and hatred? How are we doing with that? Those are things that will hold you in bondage. We have to be willing to deal with our jealousy. We have to be willing to deal with our envy and hatred, and the Bible talks extensively about this. So really, the issues that drive jealousy and envy is really a lust for recognition, right? We want to be recognized. We want to be valued. And so when it doesn't come in the way we want it, that's when we're susceptible to jealousy, envy, and hatred. What propels us daily? The quest for materialism or the quest for pleasing God? You see, what drives the quest for materialism is a lust for status, keeping up with the Joneses, the American dream, all of those things that we're living in a time now where current events dictates that many of those things are going to change. But what propels us daily? The quest for materialism or the desire to please God. And finally, do we respect God's established chain of command in the home and in the church and society? There's a chain of command that the Scriptures lay down in the home. There's a chain of command that the Scriptures lay down in the church and in society. And God requires that we submit and obey that chain of command. It is how God has ordered His universe. And so all of these things here, all of these good things on how we ought to structure and construct our lives are the exact opposite of what these grace changers, as Paul calls them, deceitful workers, false apostles, ministers of the devil. They will come into the church, and seek to influence the people of God to follow their lead instead of following the lead of the godly leaders that God gives to them, the godly examples that God sets before them. And left unchecked, they will wreak havoc in the church, and they will wreak havoc in your individual spirituality as well. And so Jude, he gives us this warning, and it's incumbent upon us to take heed and to contend earnestly for the faith. So in closing, just remember now that these internal character traits are not openly manifest, and so they're shrouded. This is what is inside of them. And so God in His mercy, God in His grace, does not leave us with this, but in the next session, Jude talks about, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, how they will manifest themselves, how they will openly manifest themselves within our fellowship and within our churches. And so I hope you will join me for that session, which also should be up very shortly. With that said, have a nice day, and God bless.